Lecture 26, Nietzsche, Critic of Christian Morality. With this lecture, we're going to have to make a sharp about face, so hang on to your seats. We've just been listening to a radical Christian. Now we're going to listen to a radical critic of Christianity. And Nietzsche is someone that is hard to be neutral about. So I want to say some things in fairness to Nietzsche so that we'll overcome some of the unfair things that have been said about him. He's got a bad reputation, and he's deserved some of it, but not all of it. He's got a reputation as being the philosopher that the Nazis liked. And it is true, the Nazis liked Nietzsche, but they misread him. Nietzsche wouldn't have liked the Nazis. He didn't like Germans, as a matter of fact. He thought they were kind of stupid and sentimental. He liked Italians and Frenchmen much better. But he had the misfortune of being outlived by his sister, who was married for much of her life to the leading anti-Semite in late 19th century Germany. Nietzsche hated anti-Semites. They were so stupid. And he particularly hated the anti-Semite that his sister married. And he loved to say nice things about Jews in order to get her provoked. Or he would say nasty things about Jews and then say that Christians are much worse. So whenever Nietzsche says something nasty about the Jews, read that as, and this goes double for Christianity, especially for German Christianity. And then you'll get the part that the Nazis left out when they read Nietzsche and liked him so much. It's important to see that Nietzsche is not a Nazi, although the Nazis were sometimes, in some respects, Nietzscheans. I think the best way to get a sympathy for Nietzsche's approach, which is often very unsympathetic to religious people, is to imagine yourself growing up in a household of Victorian women. You're a little boy growing up in a household of women, and Nietzsche did. He was a pastor's son, growing up in Germany rather than in Victorian England, but it's the same era. Imagine a parson's son growing up in a house full of pious Victorian women who are constantly telling him things like, oh, be a good little boy. Don't speak too loudly. Don't go outside. You'll get dirty, right? Imagine a philosopher talking back to those sorts of people. Imagine a critic of Christian piety and morality who's aiming at that sort of person, someone like his sister, right? Anti-Semitism goes with this stuff. Don't get dirty like those dirty Jews. Ooh, right? Imagine the mischief, the gleam of mischief in Nietzsche's eye as he undermines Christian pieties and Christian morality. He's taking aim at that stuffy, sort of thick kind of piety. Nietzsche once said, I'm the only philosopher to philosophize with my nose. Right? He recognizes when things smell bad. It's bad air inside that house with those pious, fussy women. He likes to get out where the air is clear. He constantly uses the metaphor of being up in the mountains where the air is clear and cold and bracing. Much nicer than being down inside the house where it's stuffy and there's an air of sort of rotten sickness. There's something wrong with the air in there where everybody's so pious. That's the sort of emotional tone of Nietzsche. It's a tone of liberation, right? Also of coldness and hardness, right? A willingness to get dirty, a willingness to get hurt, right? Oh, don't do that, you'll get hurt. Nietzsche despises that kind of language. He thinks it's sick and unhealthy. So, in fact, we can get at Nietzsche and his attitude toward religion by looking at the themes of sickness and health. Nietzsche himself was physically a sick man a great deal of the time, but he valued health rather than sickness, and he didn't want to think like a sick man. And he was interested, in fact, in a revaluation of values where the values of sickness and health would take priority over the values of morality. The very notion of value has an interesting history. Nietzsche is the very first great philosopher to talk about values. Right? Before that, you would talk about the good or justice or the right, but it was only in the late 19th century that the notion of value sort of migrated from economics, which was its original home, into philosophy through a bunch of minor philosophers, and finally into Nietzsche, who was the first major philosopher to use the notion of values. The notion of values is handy because there's moral values, but there's also physiological values like sickness and health. And Nietzsche thinks that physiological values are much more important to think about philosophically than moral values. Nietzsche wants values that are healthy, not sick. He wants values that don't smell bad, right? That don't smell of sickness and constriction. The sick attitude, Nietzsche thinks, is the attitude of mere response to stimuli, right? Stimulus response. That's sick. That's weak. That's, oh, don't do that, you'll get hurt. And you don't want to get hurt. So stay away from those things. Minimize your contact with all that stimuli that might get you hurt, right? Be a good little boy and don't go out and play out in adventurous ways where you might get hurt, right? Avoid pain. Maximize pleasure, minimize pain, the utilitarian view of life, which Nietzsche just despised. The healthy attitude is non-utilitarian. It's the attitude of an adventurer, a conqueror, which is wasteful, hugely energetic, spontaneous, expansive, right? You climb mountains. Of course it hurts, right? How can you climb a mountain without pain? No pain, no gain. Nietzsche would love that saying, right? So the healthy attitude is expansive. It seeks stimuli, including pain as well as pleasure. It doesn't think that pain is an objection to something. Oh, don't do that, you'll get hurt. Imagine a mountain climber faced with that attitude. Don't do that, I'll get hurt. What, you're going to stop me from climbing mountains because it cost me a little pain? Forget it. I'm going to climb some mountains. Of course it will be painful. But I'm ready for that. I'm healthy, I'm strong, I can do it. Nietzsche, in fact, is the person who said, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Right? That's the healthy attitude. Expansive, not shrinking back from stimuli by saying, oh, it'll hurt. Can't do that. Now, philosophy reflects values of sickness and health. In Nietzsche's day, there was a strong pessimistic strand of philosophy associated especially with the name of Schopenhauer, a pessimistic philosophy which took the sick view that life is bad because it's full of suffering. Right? So Nietzsche says, well, for the pessimist, pain is an objection. Right? Because there's pain in life, you think that life is a bad thing, and you judge that life is something to be avoided. Wouldn't it be nice if we could escape from the pain of this life? That's the Schopenhauerian view. Schopenhauer associates it with Buddhism, and Nietzsche says, nah, I don't want any part of that. Give me instead Greek tragedy. Greek tragedy is good stuff. That's optimistic stuff, Nietzsche thinks. Greek tragedy is an optimistic, life-affirming view of reality. It's not a pessimistic view because in Greek tragedy you affirm life in all its dreadful suffering and cruelty. It is dreadful. It is full of suffering. It is cruel. Yes, says Nietzsche. Yes. That's what tragedy does. It says yes to life in all of its suffering and pain and glory. And it says, yes, all that's bound up with one another. Right? Those tragic heroes are great, admirable human beings precisely because they go through such dreadful suffering. That's great. Yes, that's life-affirming. Now, Nietzsche thinks that Western culture went wrong after Greek tragedy. It took a wrong turn with no one less than Socrates himself, the originator of Platonism. Right? Nietzsche traces Platonism back to Socrates, who's the teacher of Plato. The Socratic, Platonic spirituality meant a judgment upon life. Right? The life in this world, with all its pain and suffering and death and decay, all its change, is bad. Right? Its pain is an objection for the sick person. Right? Socrates is a decadent in Nietzsche's view, in contrast to the Greek tragedians who were life-affirming. Socrates looked at life in all its suffering and cruelty and said, oh, let me escape from it. Let me get out of the cave, up to where things don't change and die and suffer. Let me turn my back on life and get to something that's, well, more real, Socrates thought, but which Nietzsche, of course, thinks is an illusion. There is no world above the cave. There's just the cave, the world in all its suffering and glory. So, in contrast to Platonist spirituality, which Nietzsche thinks is life-denying, Nietzsche insists on what he calls the innocence of becoming, the world of becoming, of change, of birth, of death, of decay, of suffering, all those things that Platonist spirituality wants to escape from. That world is innocent. We have no business passing judgment on it and saying it's bad because it's got suffering in it. Oh, the world is so full of evil. Oh, nonsense, says Nietzsche. Of course it's full of suffering. The healthy person knows that. The healthy person will affirm this life with its suffering. Nietzsche proposed, in fact, a fascinating test for whether you are really capable of deep affirmation of life. It had to do with a funny physical theorem, a theorem from physics at the end of the 19th century. The physicists of that time were thinking of the world as made up of atoms, a little bit like billiard balls. This was before quantum mechanics and such. So imagine a world made of atoms, right? It's a little bit like a bunch of billiard balls in a box, right? You shake up the box a lot, and eventually the atoms reconfigure themselves into the same place that they started, right? Shake the box long enough, you get all these different patterns of these atoms and billiard balls bouncing around, whatever you want to call them. Eventually they'll get back to the original state, and then the whole thing will start over again. So there were physicists at this point in history, and no one believes this anymore, but there were physicists at this point who thought that the universe was like that. A bunch of atoms that go through a bunch of cycles and changes and reconfigurations, and after a long enough period of time, millions and millions of years, billions of years maybe, we'd get back to the original state, which meant that we'd go through the whole process over again, then get back to the original state, go through the whole process over again, right? So everything that happens in your life will happen an infinite number of times, right? You will be reborn millions and millions of years from now, go through the same stuff that you went through before, the same sufferings, the same cruelties, the same pains, right? Can you say yes to that, is the question Nietzsche asks. If you can say yes to that, the eternal recurrence of the same, if you can say yes to that, then you can say yes to life. If you're a Buddhist or a Platonist, you want to escape from that eternal cycle, right? Both Buddhists and Platonists want to escape from the cycle of rebirth. Right? They don't want the eternal recurrence. They want to get out of this historical cycle of the same thing happening over and over again, especially suffering and death. Nietzsche says, no, I don't want to escape from that. Yes, let's say yes to that eternal recurrence. That's affirmation of life. Now, we can mention now another key term in Nietzsche's philosophy, the will to power. Let's go back to those atoms again. Those atoms are determined by physical laws, right? Mathematical formulas determine what will happen. There's no purpose to their movements. There's no meaning to their movements. Nietzsche will even object to the notion of physical law because it sounds like there's something rational about what they're doing, right? As if law was a good thing. No, it's just things happen. They're determined. It's fate. There's no meaning to it, which means there's no meaning to our suffering. Suffering just happens. I think Nietzsche would be very pleased with the contemporary American saying, shit happens, right? It just happens. There's no point in blaming anybody for it, right? That's the message of that saying, right? Shit happens, don't blame yourself for it. Don't feel guilty for it. It just happens. It has no meaning whatsoever. And that's liberating for Nietzsche, right? You don't have to blame anybody. Especially, you don't have to blame yourself. So the physical determinism that Nietzsche embraces means that there's no free will. Right, that's a Christian notion. Because remember, the reason for free will in Christianity the reason for that concept is to blame us for everything that goes wrong. Right? Why is there evil in the world, Augustine says? Because of our free will, because of our sin. And Nietzsche says, nah, no way. We don't have free will. There is no such thing as sin. It's nobody's fault that shit happens. So why should we blame ourselves? Right? Nietzsche is great for people who want to overcome survivor's guilt. Right? Why should we blame ourselves for the things that go wrong? Even the things that we do wrong, murder and all that sort of stuff, it was all determined in advance. There is no doer behind the deed, says Nietzsche. That's a quote. No doer behind the deed. Right? No free will that's the source of my moral agency, my personal responsibility. Things just happen. Even my own deeds just happen. Even my own life is just a piece of fate, which is fated to happen over and over and over again. So why should I blame anybody, including myself? Why should I make all these moral judgments? There's no rational basis for making those moral judgments. Okay, that's physical determinism. Now, looking again at those atoms, we need to get to this notion of the will to power. Will to power is something, well, we can see it more in the macroscopic level. All life, and we're going to get to the microscopic level in a minute, all life is will to power, Nietzsche says. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker. Struggle for existence, like in Darwin, right? So that's health, right? That healthy state of mind where you're constantly overcoming obstacles, including overcoming other people. That's the will to power. Now, Nietzsche thinks that that will to power is operative even at the level of physical forces, down at the level of microscopic particles that bump into each other and push each other aside and pull each other around, right? Nietzsche thinks that those physical forces can be interpreted as will to power, right? Those atoms and molecules, they're fighting with each other. Right? So will to power is the way it is all the way down. You can think of this in terms of the Leibnizian notion of panpsychism, right? What's the inside of physical phenomena? What's the inside of it? For Leibniz, it was sort of consciousness or perception. For Nietzsche, the inside of things is will to power, right? Because the inside of us, our basic motivation is will to power. Right? That's what motivates all life, especially if we're healthy. Now, that doesn't mean we have free will. Right? The will to power is determined by physical law. It's sheer fate. But that's what we experience life as this will to power. This attempt to get control, this attempt to conquer, this attempt to expand, to appropriate, to overcome. That's the world viewed from inside. So, from this perspective, it's not surprising that people blame each other. It would be part of a power game, of course. The surprising thing is that people would blame themselves for something. Right? That's sick. Why would anyone blame themselves? Right? Blame other people, that's a way of getting more power over them. It's a lie, of course, right? There's no such thing as real responsibility, but it gives you a reason to punish them and therefore get some control over them. But why would you blame yourself? That's really sick, right? Where do we get this notion of blaming ourselves, of ought, that Kant is so fascinated with, which Kant thinks comes from beyond the realm of nature and experience, which indicates something about the very nature of ourselves as rational beings beyond the world of experience. Nietzsche thinks that it did come from the world of experience. It came from history, right? Morality, the notion of ought, of moral obligation, and the notion of of guilty conscience. All those notions have a history. There was a time when human beings lived without them. You can see that in Homer and perhaps in the Old Testament, where people didn't seem to feel guilty. They felt things like fear and so on, but they didn't blame themselves. They didn't go around with a guilty conscience. The guilty conscience has a history, and Nietzsche wants to find out what that history is. So he suggests what you have to do is go back to ancient forms of society before there was such a thing as guilty conscience and look at the form of values that people had in those days. Nietzsche suggests that there are two forms of values to look at, what he calls famously master morality and slave morality. Think of, say, a Roman general on a horse riding by some slaves digging in a ditch, right? He's a master. He's looking at slaves. He thinks of himself as good and the slave not as evil, but as bad. That's the key valuation of the master morality, is the value pair good and bad. It's not a moral judgment, really. It's a form of valuation which says, I'm good, I'm noble, what I do is noble because what I am is noble. Right? It's sort of a matter of course that what I do is the good thing because I'm the noble person. I look at the slave and I say, well, he's dirty, he's bad, he's stinky, he's worthless, right? Not because he's done anything wrong, but just that's the way he is, right? He's one of those low-down, dirty people. Who cares about him? I'm going to go and take care of more important business. The masters don't want to think much about the slaves because they're kind of dirty and worthless. Then look at it from the slave's point of view, right? From the slave's point of view, there's a different set of values. Not good and bad, but good and evil. Good means we good slaves, we innocent, helpless, harmless people, we meek of the earth. And evil means those nasty masters who hurt us, who are strong, cruel, and violent, who conquered us. They're evil. Now, Nietzsche thinks these are very interesting things because you would think that the master morality would be stronger than the slave morality, and in a certain sense it is, but in a certain sense it is not. The slaves, although they are sick, right, they're not healthy like the masters who have that expansive, life-affirming, conquering attitude. The slaves are sick. They want to stay away from too much pain. They can't avoid much pain, but they do their best. But their advantage over the masters is they're smarter. Right? They have to think a lot to avoid pain. The masters just sort of go along and they do their conquering sort of thing, like the blonde beast, as Nietzsche famously says. But the slaves, they have to think about their situation because they can't do anything about it. When a master is offended, he fights back. He takes vengeance. He doesn't bother taking vengeance on slaves, by the way. Nietzsche doesn't talk about the masters punishing slaves because masters don't want to pay too much attention to them. They discipline slaves when they have messy conflicts and so on, but the masters don't concern themselves with slaves. They concern themselves with their equals, other members of the master class. So when a master wants to take revenge, it's like a joust or a tournament or a debt of honor, right? A fencing match or whatever, or duel, right? That kind of noble form of taking vengeance. Sir, you must give me satisfaction, right? And they fight, and that's what vengeance is like among the master class. It's a form of honor to take vengeance, right? You respect your opponent. You need a good enemy if you're one of the noble master class. Whereas the slaves really hate their enemies, right? They'd love to take vengeance, but they can't. So their vengefulness stays with them, but it becomes sort of unacknowledged, repressed, to use the Freudian term, right? And here's one of the key similarities between Freud and Nietzsche. This vengefulness becomes repressed, poisonous, subterranean, subtle, and it calls itself virtue, resignation, morality, niceness, love for others, concern, meekness, religion. Watch out for the poison behind those words, Nietzsche says. It's not as if the slaves and the weak have given up the will to power, right? Everything is will to power. The life of the weak and the sick is also will to power. It's just will to power that can't express itself directly and healthily by having a joust or a tournament or a duel or a good, healthy fight with a good enemy. It's a will to power that expresses itself by trying to get control over other people by using morality, by saying, oh, don't be selfish, be nice to me, do what I want you to do, please. Right? That's morality. That's what morality's all about. Don't go out and get dirty. That makes me anxious. Be a good little boy and stay inside and be clean. Right? It's priestly in a deep sense. I'll get back to that point in a minute. The morality that we now think of as morality, the morality that Kant talked about, comes from the slave morality. It conquered Rome. Right? The master morality had ruled Rome until the fateful event of Christianity, right? Which is the spirit of vengefulness, of subterranean vengefulness that wins culturally because it's smarter than those masters, right? So the slave morality wins in what Nietzsche calls the slave rebellion in morality. Christianity defeats the Roman Empire. And there's this spirit of what Nietzsche calls ressentiment, French for resentment, this hidden spirit of vengeance, which is expressed in morality. Now, how did this get applied to ourselves? How did we get guilt feelings? Well, what ended up happening is you have to bring in the phenomenon of the priestly class, the people who are concerned about making sure you don't get dirty. Right? Think of cleanness in Judaism, and the priest's job is to manage ritual cleanness. The priestly class in whatever religion, Hinduism, Judaism, is concerned with cleanness, discipline, avoiding the sorts of things that get you into trouble. Be a good little boy, don't get dirty, you'll get hurt. Right? And the priestly class disciplines the priestly class disciplines the slave class by getting them to keep themselves clean. Guilt feelings arise because feelings of debt and obligation, which originate as social facts, right? The word ought comes from a word meaning obligation, right? A debt. The word should, Schulde in German, is related to the word for debt, right? These oughts, or obligations, which are originally social facts, become internalized because of the ideological work of the priestly class, which get us to feel these obligations as our own. It's a bit more efficient than just beating people up when they fail to keep their obligations, right? In ancient times, if some slave didn't do his work, he got beaten up. Well, what ends up happening as civilization advances is if you don't do your work, you feel guilty. You beat up yourself, right? And the priestly class teaches you how to do that, teaches you how to internalize the feeling of debt and obligation, and that gives us morality. What happens with the triumph of Judaism through Christianity over the Roman Empire, right? The Jews beat the Romans by becoming Christians, and the Christians conquer the Roman Empire by getting the Romans to feel guilty and turns them into Germans. Right? That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's roughly how history goes for Nietzsche. And Germans are this peak of European Christian civilization. Boy, do they stink! Right? That awful smell of guilt and remorse, and that terrible suffering. Which can't acknowledge itself, that terrible spirit of vengeance, which takes vengeance on itself. What's going on here? Nietzsche's final diagnosis is, well, why do we end up blaming ourselves? Why are we saying it's my fault when I suffer, right? When my suffering is meaningless. Why am I blaming myself? Well, if I blame myself, Nietzsche's thinking, what I'm doing is I'm saying my suffering has meaning. Right? My suffering isn't just meaningless fate. It does have meaning. I blame myself, and thus I say, I'm being punished. right? God is punishing me, right? My suffering has a meaning because I'm wrong, right? So guilt makes suffering worse, right? Not only am I suffering because I'm a slave, but it's also my fault. But by blaming myself, I make my suffering have meaning, and that preserves the will to power in me. Nietzsche puts it this way, to sum up the results of the genealogy of morals. Man suffers from the problem of his meaning. The ascetic ideal, the ideal of self-discipline and of guilty conscience that it gives rise to, is a way of saying, my suffering has a meaning. It makes it worse, but what ends up happening is by saying it's my fault, I give it a meaning, and I learn to desire nothingness. Right? I learn to reject life and all its suffering and desire to escape from life, escape from being. I desire or will nothingness. But Nietzsche says, man would rather will nothingness than not will. By blaming himself, this caged animal, which is what human beings become in civilization, right? This beast that gets caged and has to internalize his debts and blame himself and hold himself obligated, gets caged and constricted and suffers. And, well, at least that preserves the will to power by preserving the will in its vengeful, sick state. But at least it preserves it by giving a meaning to suffering and guilt. Right? Guilt gives a meaning to suffering. And although that makes the suffering worse, it preserves the will to power in its sick state. And man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Now, we can mention some further developments of this guilty conscience. We can talk about the development of what Nietzsche calls the will to truth. Right? This is a fascinating development because the priestly class gives rise to the scholarly class. It turns out, if you think about the Middle Ages, all scholars in the Middle Ages were priests, right? Even in the 19th century, if you were a professor or a don at Oxford, you had to be a bachelor, right? There's an ascetic ideal lying behind the ideal of scholarship. The ascetic ideal is closely related to the priestly system of valuations, the guilty conscience, this way of internalizing our debts. Scholars have to be ascetics, right? Because the will to truth demands a certain kind of discipline and morality. Scholars are historically the successors of priests in this particular ascetic sense, in that they put the will to truth above all things, right? Think of Socrates, desiring wisdom more than any of the pleasures of the flesh. That's one sense in which scholars are ascetics. But in a more fundamental sense, in the 19th century, Protestant scholars, with their will to truth, discovered biblical historical scholarship, discovered the historical basis of the Bible, which undermined traditional Christian belief. At least that's how Nietzsche understands Protestant biblical scholarship. So these scholars, with their will to truth, undermined their own desires, undermined what they wanted to find in religion, undermined their own deepest religious beliefs. Right? That's a form of asceticism. Right? It takes a very honest, rigidly moral person to pursue the truth, even if it leads you to undermine your own religion and to make you an atheist, right? That's the great, glorious victory of the will to truth, the victory of asceticism. And that's what Nietzsche means, by the way, when he said in the famous saying, God is dead. God is dead is old news, Nietzsche thinks, right? The Christian God is no longer believable. That's what God is dead means. And why can't we believe him anymore? Well, because we have killed him, Nietzsche says. We scholars, especially. We Europeans, right? We've undermined our own beliefs by looking at the history behind the Bible and discovering that in the Bible, the will to power is operative, right? The God of the Bible is an invention of the will to power of human beings. We can see that when we look critically at the Bible, Nietzsche thinks. So we're the ones who've killed God. We're the ones who've made God unbelievable to ourselves. But the hard thing is for us to admit to ourselves, right? I'm the one who's killed God. I, in my scholarly honesty, my will to truth, behind that there's the will to power. I've killed God. I'm left without any pre-designated meanings to my life, right? There's no ultimate truth to find in a Platonist sense or in a Christian sense. And Christianity is really just, for Nietzsche, it's really just Platonism for the masses, he calls it. And if you think of the history of Christian Platonism, there's some plausibility to that. That whole notion of this realm of eternal truth outside of this world, we've undermined that. We can't believe it anymore. All we're left with is this world of appearances, Plato would call it. The world of lies, appearances, art. Right? The nice thing about art, you see, is artists lie with a good conscience. They make appearances. They tell stories that aren't true. And they do this all in a good conscience. Now, here's Nietzsche's final suggestion. Wouldn't it be nice if scholarship could be like art? Wouldn't it be nice if scholars could lie with a good conscience? Right? Wouldn't it be nice if life could be an experiment for the knower, not a duty? That knowledge itself could be a world of dangers and victories in which heroic feelings, too, find place to dance and play. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have what Nietzsche calls a gay science, or a cheerful scholarship? A scholarship which is no longer ascetic, no longer this deep discipline of morality, but is a form of play. That even the discovery of truth could be a form of play. Like art, a form of inventing new meanings, rather than being obedient to an ideal of truth which you have to conform to, an ideal of truth and meaning which is already there. No, scholarship itself, like art, can be a form of play where we make up the meanings for ourselves, make them up as we go along. It's nice that God is dead, Nietzsche thinks, because now we can dance. We can make it up as we go along. That's the ideal of cheerful scholarship.